Hey everyone, welcome. I'm Naomi, and today I want to share something with you that might be missing from your yoga practice. In fact, it's probably missing from everyone's yoga practice because, well, are you lifting weights in your yoga practice? Most likely not, okay? Because yoga is not a strength-based practice. Now, there are going to be some people who are going to argue with me about that, but the truth is that your body weight can only take you so far, right? Holding Warrior 2 for 2 minutes is fantastic, but squats are going to build strength in your legs considerably more than just holding your own body up, right? Plank pose is fantastic, but plank pose can only take you so far when it comes to building shoulder strength, right? You actually need more when it comes to figuring out if you are capable of sustaining greater load, okay? And that's what strength training is. It's increasing your capacity for load. So what I want to talk about today specifically are shoulder exercises that build strength. And we are going to talk about two categories of exercises: pushing exercises and pulling exercises. And these are things that really don't show up from a strength-based standpoint in your average yoga class, but actually show up in lots of poses, right? So downward facing dog could really benefit from both pushing and pulling. Okay, your crow pose could really benefit from that pushing practice. So have I convinced you? Have I given you enough information to get curious about what pushing or pulling exercises might look like and how you could potentially integrate them into your movement practice? Maybe not your yoga practice, but your movement practice, so that you are building more sustainable strength? Well, if you're interested, let's dive right in because I have some really, really cool stuff to share with you. Let's go, and I'll see you on the other side. Before we get started, I do want to mention that what I'm sharing with you today is mostly just for learning purposes. So I'm not necessarily doing this as a workout for you. It's more to give you options for how you can integrate these actions and these exercises into your movement routine. So we're going to cover pushing and pulling today, but the way that I'm offering them, the way that I'm teaching them, is more just so you can see what they are, maybe try them 1 or 2 times through, and then potentially add them into what you're already doing and incorporate them in with another action. So if you are doing a pushing action, you don't want to do only pushing, you would want to do pushing and then maybe something for your legs or for your core, right? If you are doing a pulling action, you don't want to do then another pulling action after that. You also want to do something else that is going to be opposite or works a different muscle group or different actions than what you are doing with those pulling muscles. So I want to be really clear about that before we get started. So, knowing that and moving forward, we're going to start. The first category of exercises, shoulder strengthening exercises that we're going to focus on, are pushing exercises. And specifically, we're going to focus on the overhead press and an incline push-up. Now, there are lots of other pushing exercises that you can do, but these are pretty fundamental and I think in some ways the most accessible of the pushing exercises. That's a personal opinion, okay? But that has what has worked best for me personally, but also from a teaching standpoint. For the first exercise, the overhead press, you're going to need 2 weights, okay? And you're going to grab your 2 weights. And again, remember, this is just for practice and getting a sense of what it feels like to do this if you are unfamiliar with these exercises. So you're going to grab your 2 weights, bend your elbows to pull the weights up above your shoulders, and then you are going to anchor through your feet really powerfully, push down through your feet, and push your weights up overhead. Then you bring the weights back down and you repeat it. Push the weights up overhead. Okay? Now, ultimately, you're aiming for keeping your shoulders stacked over your hips, stacked over your heels, stacked over your feet. Okay, what you want to avoid is trying to push up and sending your ribs forward. I'm not even going to push up that way because it doesn't feel good. It's not particularly awesome for shoulder strength, and it doesn't really give you what you're after, which is a pushing action. Instead, what's happening is a lot of rib flare, right? So you're using mobility to hoist the weights over your shoulders, and that's not really helpful when you're aiming for strength. Okay, so again, you're standing evenly on 2 feet. Your feet are about hip width apart, maybe wider. You bring your weights up above your shoulders. Palms facing in is the most basic way, the most foundational way. And then you push straight up overhead, bring the weights back down, and then you repeat it. Okay, and ideally is kind of a funny word, right? But ideally you're aiming for pressing those weights overhead maybe 6 to 10 times. And that's kind of a wide range. 6 times sort of indicates, wow, this is a heavier weight for me. This is a challenge. I could maybe do 2 more, maybe 3 with integrity, keeping my shoulders over my hips, but probably not more than that. Okay, going up to 10, it might be saying, this is moderate, maybe even a lighter weight for me, and pressing those weights overhead doesn't necessarily feel easy. Easy, I think, is maybe not the right word, but it's not super challenging, right? If I did 15, 20, like at that point, my muscles might start to get tired, but I could still do it. And that's an indication that maybe the weight is a little bit light. So that's just sort of weight training basics. That's a whole other video. But I do want you to have an idea of if I'm going to do this on my own, I might be doing somewhere between 6 and 10 with these weights, and then a rest, and then I do it again, and then rest, and then do it again, and then rest, and maybe do it again, maybe do it a 4th time. Okay, if you're starting out, maybe you just do 2 sets. Okay, but that's the overhead press, and there are a lot of ways to do the overhead press. You could do single arm, you could do it seated, lots of ways to do the overhead press, but the most basic way is standing and pressing straight up overhead. Now, the second exercise that we're going to do are incline push-ups. Now, for an incline push-up, I'm going to get these out of the way. You want a chair or a bench. And really, ideally, you want something wide enough so that when you place your hands on it, your hands are a little bit wider apart than your shoulders. You don't want to be really narrow here because there's not enough space to bring your chest through, okay, or to bring your torso through. So with the incline push-up, your hands are going to go nice and wide. If the chair that you're using isn't quite wide enough, you can wrap your fingers around the edge, but again, ideally you want something a little bit wider. So if you have a bench, that's great. I have a bench. I didn't drag it in here because it goes with my kitchen table and it's long and heavy and awkward. Okay, but that's often what I use if I have more time. Okay, if I have less time, I grab the chair and I just bring it in because honestly, the chair is fine. Okay, so incline push-up, you want to step back until your shoulders are slightly on the diagonal. So not necessarily completely over your wrists. You want just a little bit of an angle. And you want your whole body to be tight and tense. And I don't mean tight, rigid. I mean tense and holding structure so that when you lower down, you're not lowering your chest and leaving your butt in the air. You lower down, taking your chest and your ribs evenly to the chair. And then you push away. Right? Again, chest and ribs evenly to the chair and push away. Okay, that's the basic idea. Okay, if something like this height feels too low and you have something higher, you could also do it at a countertop, right? I can't bring my kitchen countertops in here, so I'm showing you with a chair, but you might start higher up. Okay, you might be able to take it even lower down, okay, as you work with this through time. But again, ideally with something like this, you might be starting with a lower rep range, like 3 to 5. Okay, once you start building up and you're able to do like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe more than that, several times in a row again, right? So let's say you're doing, like we were talking about with the overhead press, you are doing maybe 5 or 6 and then you can rest. And then you do it again, 5 or 6 and then rest. 5 or 6 and then rest. That might be an indication that you can maybe go a little bit lower. Okay, but again, you are going to know faster than I will. These are just general suggestions. Okay, and also remember that it might not be like 5 or 6 of these in rest. You might actually do something else along with it, like squats or deadlifts or something else that supplements this shoulder work that you're doing with strength. Okay, so just keep in mind that there's a wide range of what you can do when it comes to building strength. You could start really simple, right? Doing those single sets where you're just doing that one exercise and then take a break, or you could add to it. But you do want to make sure that you are only doing really one thing that is taxing that area or that action. So you're not doing multiple pushing in a row. You are doing a single pushing exercise, then maybe something completely different, and then repeating it. Okay? Let's move on to some pulling exercises, which is something that if you exclusively do a yoga practice, you never see, right? Pulling is not something that really exists in yoga, and especially from a strength standpoint. Now, there are two There are two exercises that I'm going to focus on that I think are really fantastic that demonstrate pulling in action. And that's the bent over row and pullovers, okay? Supine pullovers. Okay, for this, you're really only gonna need one weight as opposed to two, but you do still need your chair because I'm gonna show you a single arm bent over row that you could build into two if you want. So I'm gonna grab one of my weights. I'm gonna place it down in front of the chair, place my hands on the chair. Again, I'm walking myself back so that I'm not really tight to the chair and rounding through my back, but walking so there's a little bit of space. My feet really aren't directly underneath my hips because I'm gonna wanna bend my knees and shift away from the chair. I'm gonna reach down, grab the weight. Once I lift it off the ground, I'm gonna plug my arm bone into my shoulder socket, and then I pull my elbow toward the sky so the weight comes to my ribs, and then I release. Weight to my ribs and release. Okay, and this is a pulling action. Okay, you gotta be careful to not like whack your boob with the weight, which happens to me way more often than I like to say. Okay, but you're gonna do maybe 6 to 10 on one side and then 6 to 10 on the other. Okay, now the idea of 6 to 10, it's just a sort of basic reference point for where you can be. Obviously, as you progress through strength training practice, that might change, right? You might have very different goals, but 6 to 10 is just a really solid rep range to consider when you are first starting strength training in this way. Okay, so again, so it's really clear and so that I'm even on both sides. I'm gonna go to the other side. My right hand goes to the chair, my knees bend slightly so that I can take my hips back. So I'm not rounding through my back, but just staying really nice and long through my spine. And that allows my arm bones to stay very integrated without putting pressure on my spine when I do this, okay? I'm gonna bend my knees to grab the weight, lift it up, and then I plug my arm bone into the shoulder socket, row, and release. Okay, I'm gonna turn slightly so you can see. This is just without using the chair, but it's the same idea, row and release, okay? You wanna keep your chest going forward, hips going back, row and release, okay? Keeping your arm bone integrated the whole time. Now, you can build up to doing two hands, right? Holding two weights in each hand. That's fantastic. You can absolutely do that. It's a little bit more work, which is why we tend to start with that single arm row, because you can use the chair for support to get your bearings. You do want to keep your torso parallel to the floor so that you can just isolate the pulling action. You are pulling the weight away from the floor and then taking it back down, pulling up again, okay? Those are your single arm bent over rows, and they're one of my absolute favorite exercises to work shoulder strength, shoulder health, generally speaking. The last exercise that we're gonna do, the second one of the pulling, are pullovers, supine pullovers. So you're lying on the floor. So I'm gonna get the chair out of the way. Okay, I'm gonna lie on my back. And there are a lot of different ways to do this, but I think the easiest, if you're using a dumbbell, is to have the weight next to you. You can grab it with both hands and then roll onto your back. Alternatively, find a non-awkward way of coming up. You could bring the weight into both hands and then lower down. That's just a lot more abdominal work, right? So if you really want to work your abs when you start this, you just keep the weight in your hands as you lower down. Okay, now you start with the weight at your chest, press straight up. Then you're going to take the weight over your head until it taps the floor and then bring it back up, straight up over your chest. You're not trying to go to your knees. The weight is up above your chest, goes overhead and back up. Arms stay straight, you try to tap the floor and bring it back up. Okay, arms stay straight, you try to tap the floor and bring it back up. Okay, what you want to be really clear here too is that you're not arching through your low back. Here, you want to keep your ribs moving toward the floor, which is why it's really helpful to keep your knees bent. Okay, if you stretch your legs straight out, that's fine, but it's a lot harder to keep your ribs moving down and to keep your pelvis fairly neutral, right, so that you're steadier in your foundation. Weight goes overhead and back up. Okay, so those are your pullovers. Okay, now there are a lot of ways, just awkwardly trying to get back up off the floor. There are a lot of ways to advance pullovers, but that's a really simple way to start. I have seen other things where people have held onto the two ends of the dumbbell so that you have these two ends, right, the bells in each hand and taking the weight overhead. That's fine. I find it's a little bit less of a steady grip, particularly as the weights get heavier. So if you are working with heavier weights, You could also work with kettlebells. I don't want to complicate things. I'm just sort of saying there are a lot of different ways to do this. The way that I've showed you is really, I think, in a lot of ways, the simplest to do. And it just gives you a lot of support, 2 hands on the center of the bell. And that way you can pull, right? So this is the action, right? If I'm sitting up, and I'm not going to do it this way, but you're pulling, arms overhead and back down. Arms overhead and back to your chest, right? Which is something that can really benefit so much of what we do generally, functionally in life. But also if you're looking at your yoga practice, there's so many poses that we do that require this big stretch, arm overhead. And wouldn't it be helpful if we were stronger in those muscles in order to feel steadier in those poses? Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this educational class today. Again, I know this wasn't my typical practice shared on YouTube, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what some of these exercises look like to pique your curiosity, okay? To give you an opportunity to see some of the 4 exercises that I add not only to my own practice, but to my teaching. Okay, so what I try to do when I approach strength training is go to a fairly basic place at first so that I'm not overwhelming my students, but keeping things really simple and then applying them to things that they might do in a yoga practice. So what does this look like in my teaching? Well, what it looks like is picking a pose or an exercise of the month in my online studio and then building not only strength classes around it, but building also yoga practices around it. Coming up with simple flows that we can do that really highlight the pose, but then coming up with strength sets that also help enhance the pose. Okay, so for example, in the month of November, I'm teaching a table balance. Now, table balance is when you're on your hands and knees, you take one arm forward and the opposite leg back. It's a really core-focused pose, but you're also stretching your arm overhead and your leg back. So when it comes to strength, well, what would help a pose like that? Well, absolutely a pushing pose or a pushing exercise. So that would be like the overhead press that I showed you in this video today. That could also be potentially incline push-ups, right? Because you're keeping the core of your body really taut, really tense, really strong while you are bending your elbows, lowering your chest to the ground and pushing back up. It requires a connection from the top of your head all the way to your heels. So that might be another pushing practice that could show up this month in my online studio. Right? So not only am I going to do core practices and balancing practices, but I'm also going to add in these strength exercises and strength supersets, in fact, within dedicated strength classes that highlight these actions to make a pose like a table balance feel stronger and more accessible. So what that looks like when it comes to actually teaching it is that I teach a strength-based class and a flow-based class. The strength-based class includes a warm-up, a strength superset, and a flow. Okay, the warm-up prepares you for the strength superset, which is comprised of 2 exercises usually that are complementary opposite. So it might be that overhead press and a squat, right? Or it might be an overhead press and a deadlift, right? It could be all kinds of things, right? But it's going to incorporate one exercise that really works one part of the pose and one exercise that works another part of the pose. And then it ends with a flow that really builds on the pose of the month. Then I teach a flow class that builds on that 3-pose flow. And then you get to do a much more complex, interesting, dynamic flow that is stronger because you've done some strength training to enhance it and to make it even better. If that sounds like your kind of fun, if that sounds like the kind of movement practice that you want to do, then I would love for you to join me in my online studio, Move with Naomi. We have a lot of fun there. The classes are really short. They are between 8 minutes and 30 minutes long to make it super easy to fit into your busy day. And you get to work on one pose, one action all month long and get stronger and better at it progressively. So if you would like to do those things, you can check out the description. And there is a link to join my online studio plus a coupon code that will give you 50% off your first 2 months, which actually means you get a month for free, which I think is a pretty sweet deal. So if you're interested, definitely take a look at that link in the description below. And if not, that's also okay. I'm really glad that you're here with me on YouTube. Thanks for being here. And I hope to see you back again really soon. Until then, bye.